This week, Kumar and I discuss Warren Ellis and Darrick Robertson's Transmetropolitan. First, just a reminder that you can help this podcast by making your Amazon purchases via deconstructingcomics.com/Amazon and make that your bookmark for future purchases. We'll then get a percentage of what you spend. It costs you nothing extra and helps us cover web hosting and the other costs of presenting this show every week. We really appreciate your support. This is Tim.
And this is Kumar.
And this is Deconstructing Comics. Welcome to Deconstructing Comics. This is Tim in Tokyo with Kumar in Melbourne, Australia. How's everything going?
Great.
Okay. That's
You've
good.
broken format.
Well, Mulele's always after me to be a little talky, so...
Yeah.
But yeah, so, well, we were probably kind of foolish to do this. We decided, hey, let's read a whole 60-issue series and do an episode about it.
We were foolish, and we made the right decision because initially, I think we were talking about doing a bit of it, or the start of it, and then I'm really glad we ended up deciding to do all 60.
Yeah. I think it has to be taken as a set. There are some other series in the past that you and I, or I and other people, or whatever, have talked about part of it, and I kind of feel compelled almost to go back and do those same works from beginning to end,
right.
Like Preacher or Full Metal Alchemist. But so what we did this time was Transmetropolitan, written by Warren Ellis, art by Darrick Robertson. This was published from 1997 to 2002. I found from Wikipedia it was originally part of a short-lived DC sci-fi imprint called Helix.
Yes.
Which actually was originally supposed to be called Matrix, but there was this film coming out with that title, so they had to change it.
Really? Is that what happened?
Yeah, well, that's what Wikipedia says anyway. And then when Helix went under, for various reasons, they shifted Transmetropolitan over to Vertigo. And pretty much all the other series that Helix was publishing just died.
Yeah.
But apparently this one had good enough numbers that they wanted to keep it going.
My understanding is that the other, from what I've heard from talking to people, the other ones were not good.
Yeah, I have no idea. None of them sounded familiar. There was one in there by Howard Chaykin, and I don't know, but...
Oh, right, okay. Well, it was supposed to be a science fiction line, as opposed to, like, Vertigo, which was the horror line.
Really? Vertigo was supposed to be a horror line?
Yeah.
Because
Is that a sarcastic question, or are you...
No. Seriously, because...
Yeah.
Well, see, I was really not paying attention to this stuff at that time. There were no podcasts, including, not ours or anyone else's. And I was reading like 99% Marvel at the time.
Yeah.
And I really wasn't even aware of Vertigo until about 2005 or 6. And by that time, it was not really a horror line at all. It was getting to be more of a creator-owned line.
Yeah, it was kind of the house that Karen Berger and Alan Moore built, really, because when it launched, they pulled a couple of titles over, so the flagships were Sandman and Swamp Thing, and eventually Preacher joined that family as well, but initially they were almost all horror titles, and most of them were really, Alan Moore light kind of stuff. And then Helix, which started a few years later, was supposed to be the science fiction equivalent. But it was not a success, and it just fell apart, except for Transmetropolitan, which got absorbed into Vertigo, and that's about the time, Vertigo was changing a bit. But I think they still try to... I think if you look at the Vertigo titles now. They're still kind of in that family, like Why the Last Man and Fables and stuff like that.
I never really thought of those as horror titles, but...
No, but I think they're kind of in the vicinity of the other horror titles. But anyway, it was their mature readers line, at the very least.
Yeah, they're definitely that. Okay, well, so let's explain a little bit about what Transmetropolitan is about. Well, it's unclear when it's taking place. Wikipedia says that it's the 23rd century. I'm not sure when that's mentioned.
Where did they get that information
I don't know. In issue 42, it's explained that no one remembers what year it is.
Yeah, that's mentioned more than once. That people don't even really know what year it is. And I'm not sure if that was a sarcastic comment, but it seems a bit hard to believe considering so much of it revolves around elections and terms. How many terms people are serving. It seems like most people would know what year it is.
Yeah, I mean, there's that sign there that's showing, like, it's been X number of years since something happened, and the numbers have to keep changing. And he's talking about how people don't remember what the year number was, so they just have to count that way. But I think that's supposed to be sort of a way of saying that people have forgotten the past and they're not remembering. People who forget the past are condemned to repeat it. That kind of thing.
I kind of took it that way, but it's with this series, some of those details are very hard to judge whether he was being serious or sarcastic.
So the main character is Spider Jerusalem. He was a very famous journalist, and he got sick of everything and went up a mountain and lived in the wilderness for 5 years. And now he's like so hairy he looks kind of like Alan Moore, actually.
Yeah, I think that's deliberate.
Yeah, I think so. But then he's called by a publisher who says, you owe us 2 books that you signed a contract on like 5 years ago or something. And and he thought he was going to write in the mountains, I think, but he just couldn't get inspired. So he has to go back to what they call the city and get a job writing a column so that he'll kind of get back into writing, and then he'll have something to collect in books or whatever. So he goes in this like kind of voice activated shower, and it causes him to lose all his hair. I'm not sure how that works.
Yeah. There was some sort of malfunction.
And then he never has hair again for the rest of the series.
Yeah.
But that's kind of his trademark look, and he's got this little spider tattoo on his scalp, and then he gets these weird glasses that are created by this technology that they call makers, which can produce anything that you want, anything that you ask them to make. But the makers are sometimes on drugs, even though they're machines. And because of that, it produces these glasses that one lens is a green rectangle and the other one is a red circle. But that also becomes part of his trademark look. And so the rest of the series is him being this kind of Hunter S. Thompson type of reporter, and reporting on the injustices of what's going on in the city or the country. Yeah, and by the way, I thought it was kind of, it's interesting to look at something that's about the future that was written in the past. I mean, not that long ago, the past, but in the first few issues anyway, the telephones all have like cords, and they look like 1980s phones almost. But then later it goes to like you can get. I didn't quite get how this works, but you can get a trait. That's
so
just
there's
like
these things
in your
called
body.
traits. Mm-hmm. That's right. Yeah, there's some sort of implant, like temporary implants.
Or like, don't you just like take a pill or something, and then you suddenly have a phone inside you?
Could be, yeah. I don't know if he does it by pill or what. But there is talk about different types of traits. That's actually an interesting thing about the phones, because, and I wonder why he started with the corded phones, because Warren Ellis is he's like the futurist in comics. Like, he's read up on all this futurist stuff about what's going to happen in 20 years or 50 or 100 years. And he has ideas about all these kinds of technologies. And there's some wild stuff in here, like the traits, which is super advanced, but I'm sure he's probably heard the idea somewhere or extrapolated it based on existing technology. There's this thing where, people can turn to gas. And there's stuff like information gathering gas, which is undetectable, and all sorts of stuff that can remove any trace of DNA. There's all sorts of super advanced technology involved there. There's some stuff that was really shockingly prescient, like now, I think he started around 97, but there's this thing on the TV screens where, like, the ads are constantly popping up and you can click on them and it'll take you to the next thing, to follow the ad. And I'm like, I don't remember the internet being that bad in 97. I think he kind of predicted how bad it was going to be. And this thing about, like, there are TV screens in the sidewalks, so wherever you're walking. And it's kind of getting almost the amount of screens that are around, like, like in taxis and stuff that are playing you ads. It's kind of getting...
Yeah, that's completely believable. That we'd be there by that point. It was completely
believable. There was a lot of stuff in there that was like, oh yeah, that's... And there's another thing where he's watching TV and they are tracking... He mentioned that they're tracking what they watch and feeding them ads based on that. And I don't, again, in 97, I don't remember cookies being that advanced that,
it's
like
hard to
it is
remember,
now on
but,
Facebook. Yeah. So there's some really wild stuff, but at the same time, some of it is, like the other side of it is the political side, and some of it certainly felt prescient, but maybe it was just observant. Like, I don't know really exactly. Were we in exactly the same place in 1997 that we are in, 2017? I don't know, but I think we need to unpack some of that stuff.
Well...
But I want to say, before we get into it, there's two things I wanted to say. One is, he does fight against injustices, but the reason I'm glad we are doing 60 issues is because there is a very clear through line of plot from beginning to end, which involves this election where... There's a real horror of a president in position who's running again, and Spider's like, I hope to God this guy doesn't get reelected. Then he finds out that the other guy that's running against him is probably just as bad or worse in some ways, and he ends up getting elected. And then this guy's a real...
Well, he wants to get elected just to be mean to people, basically.
Just to abuse his power. Exactly. He's a real sociopath, and he specifically targets Spider. So there's this whole thing where Spider has to, for 60 issues, really find a way to take this guy down. The other thing I wanted to mention before we start is this is really Ellis's magnum opus. Like, it is, if you're going to read one Ellis series, this is probably the one. I mean, it's the most famous of all the ones he's done. But it is super vitriolic. Like, it is angriest consistently for 5 years of comics, is so angry, page after page, issue after issue. It's amazing how vehemently furious it is at all times.
Yeah, and I felt like there was a lot in it that's meant to be kind of, well, at least some people might find it kind of cathartic. You're just beating up on kind of anybody, anybody in power, anybody that you don't like.
Oh yeah, I think it's I would actually describe it as a power fantasy for adults, for left leaning adults like myself. It's like the replacement for the Superman or the superhero power fantasy. It's like, don't you wish you could take down politicians like this? because Spider becomes so famous, and I can't think of any analog in the world of a reporter.
No.
Even Hunter S. Thompson was never that super famous that they were celebrities.
Yeah, maybe Cronkite, maybe.
Well, I don't know. When he walked down the streets, were crowds following him? Yeah,
I mean, he's like Beatles famous.
yeah, and there's a scene where he gets some spy equipment from a guy, and the guy says, "You got to do this, Spider. You're our man." Like he's the man of the people, and people are counting on him to fix their government. Almost, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So it's kind of like that's why I see it as a power fantasy, because it's not. There's nobody like that, and you're always wishing when you look at politics, you're always like, God, I wish somebody would dig up some dirty pictures on this guy so we could get rid of him, And it's never that easy. The trail is never that easy. They haven't forgotten some picture of them having sex with an animal on something, but fortunately for Spider, he's always able to find a source, and he's able to find those pictures, and that politician XYZ ends up killing himself, because he's got evidence that he's a pedophile or something like that, and all that stuff. It's real fist pumping stuff when you read it, but in the real world, it's almost frustrating. It's not that easy.
Mm-hmm. But I felt too like, the way that Spider goes about it, it's completely like the ends justifies the means type of thing, because he gets really violent with people. He beats up people. He shoots people more or less in self-defense. Journalistic ethics go completely out the window.
Yeah, well, there's, he kind of, later in the book, he has no publisher. He's on his own. So he says more than once, I think he says, journalistic ethics no longer apply to me because I'm not a journalist. He's just a guy out trying to get this information to take down the president. But there's a few times where people kind of call him out on it. Like, there's one where at the end he finds the last surviving prostitute that had sex with the president while he was campaigning, and all of the other prostitutes have been killed off, conveniently, and she's the last one alive, and he says, okay, I want to interview you, and then they do the interview, and he's about to broadcast it, and then she's leaving. She's like, I'm leaving. They're like, you can't leave. They're going to kill you out there. And she's like, I don't want to talk to you. I don't want to be around you anymore, Spider, because you interviewed me, and then you don't care about me anymore.
Yeah, you got what you wanted.
You got what you wanted. You treat me like a prostitute. Like, he kind of doesn't care about individuals. He's kind of the type of journalist that's just after the story, no matter what it is.
Yeah, and I could understand her attitude about that, but still, why was getting killed preferable? I couldn't quite believe that. I got the point.
No, I think she didn't believe that she was going to get killed. Although amazingly, she does just a few panels later. Although I don't know how they knew where she was. But anyway, she just, it's like a few pages later, as soon as she steps out, almost she gets killed. But I think my sense was that she didn't believe she was actually going to get murdered, and she thought they were just, because she had already been sick of being in hiding for so long, and she was trying to get out of there, and I don't know. And yeah, like, how would they know where she was at that stage? Because nobody was able to find her except for Spider, and then suddenly, as soon as she leaves, she's killed.
Well, they were reading the comic, so they knew where she was.
Oh.
Or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, another thing I wanted to talk about a little bit. So I felt like sort of, what do I want to say, the tone of the book, in a way, I felt like this and Garth Ennis's Preacher and Grant Morrison's The Filth are all have some kind of a similar feel to them. There are all these British writers who came up, in the 90s, and that all like, lots of F-bombs. Any context is a context to mention sexual and scatological references. Is it just kind of a rebellion against the comics code? just because they can, or I wasn't sure there was really a reason for that.
I think this one, I don't know what the reason is. My feeling is this one is more extreme. Like there's more mentions of semen and shit per page than in Preacher or The Filth. I think Preacher was kind of organic, and when that guy has sex with that chicken, it's really kind of funny. Here it's it's just, I don't know, it's just the default insult mode, and it becomes, by issue 60, it's just part of the wallpaper. You don't even notice it anymore.
Well, and I think it gets kind of toned down in the last third of the series also. When I felt like when it got more exciting there at the end, and it was more about getting to the conclusion, I felt like that crudeness kind of faded. I mean, it was still there, but there's not as much.
There's a part, I can't remember what, there's a part, one of the political advisors, Schacht, Spider discovers that he's, as I mentioned before, he was a pedophile. Schacht kills himself, and then the following issue, or the issue after, you hear a news report about that someone has literally shit on Schacht's grave, and the DNA seems to match Spider. So he's literally shit on this guy's grave, and that's quite late. That's not like in the first 2/3. So that kind of stuff was still.
Well, yeah, it didn't go away for sure.
No,
but no. I felt like there was like less on a per page basis than there had been.
Yeah, and it might even be a little bit less violent. Like there's some really extreme violence in it that was shocking, even to me. Like there's one where he attacks this guy in a hotel with a with the bell, the ding ding bell, when you're trying to get service, and he smashes his nose in, and it's so full on.
It's like ketchup packet type bleeding. You hit someone and then there's blood everywhere.
Yeah. And we haven't mentioned the bowel disruptor. So, his weapon, which combines both the violence and the scatological obsession, is Spider's weapon of choice is this bowel disruptor with all these hilarious settings on it, like watery, loose, prolapse.
I think he invents a few other settings later on too.
Oh yeah, there's a lot. Every time he uses it, there's another setting that we haven't heard about that just sounds insane. So that's their. But then even that kind of goes with the end because he starts carrying an actual gun and he stops using the bowel disruptor.
Yeah, well, actually, I worked through the whole series over the past X number of weeks. I don't know. It took kind of a while because I was busy putting the previous episode together. But then I went back and read much of Volume 1 today, and I saw like when the bowel disruptor first appears and his assistant Shannon comes in, she comments something like you seem to be awful kind of fixated on bowel stuff or something. So I mean the comic itself actually comments on that's kind of Spider's obsession.
Yeah, there's no much like how his ethical flaws are also called into question from time to time. I think Ellis kind of knows. He's kind of aware of what he's writing. It's not like it's not like he's writing it without realizing that he's doing it all the time.
Yeah.
But yeah, it is. I felt like this had a different tone than when Morrison goes this far, or even Mark Millar goes this far. There's something. I can't really identify it. It's just, like I said, it's just so in your face all the time that you just start kind of forgetting about it. I felt, anyway. What about the food, too? We should... Because there's a lot of... I think this is one of the... This is one of the craziest futures. Like, it's one of those busy, the busy streets and the tall buildings and the video everywhere kind of futures. But people are really, like, everything's, like, there's, as we talk about the screens and sidewalk, but some people also have screens on their skin. And like there's weird like mating between kind of IO ports on people that have wearing like cybernetic suits and stuff, and it's one of these really...
and a lot of it is stuff that's just kind of in the background. You have to kind of scan the backgrounds. Darrick Robertson works a lot of stuff into those backgrounds.
Yeah, it kind of reminded me of Hard Boiled by Darrow and Frank Miller, and Jeff Darrow did do some of the covers on this, and they're kind of perfect because they're just so overpopulated with people doing crazy stuff. It is a super crazy future, and there was something about that the food, the types of food that they eat, right. So all this stuff is part of the setting, which is all kind of window dressing around this political through line that goes through the 60 issues. So the things that they eat are crazy. Like,
so there's borderline immoral, but even Spider doesn't comment on it. It's just sort of normal.
Right. So they clone people. There's a certain company that's cloning people and for sale for meat. Like the humans, you can eat, you can cannibalize these humans. They have no brains. They're like brainless humans. But there's like powdered, I think he mentioned powdered baby at one stage. At one stage, he goes face first into a bucket of caribou eyeballs. God, I started noting them down, and I can't even remember all of them now.
There was one, I think it was early on, where these two guys are walking down the street holding opposite ends of a pole that like an entire dog is impaled on, like they're going to eat it.
Yeah, yeah. It's not just, it's just the weirdest stuff. If I think of any more, I'll bring them up during the show. All right, sorry. Go ahead. What were you going to say?
The city itself. Well, I mean, you see a lot of kind of New York type landmarks, like the Chrysler Building is in there, and the Statue of Liberty holding a sword rather than a torch. So Wikipedia actually has a separate article about just the city in the series.
Wow. Okay.
And someone has gone through and identified little references here and there that point to the city being not just New York, but kind of like a lot of northeastern cities kind of grown together.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Up to even including Chicago.
Okay.
Because it mentions, and I don't remember where this was in the series, but there's a police station called the Richard P. Daley Precinct House, so that refers to Chicago, and also talking about the Great Lakes being on the western edge of the city.
Oh, right.
But then there are also some references that almost suggest that San Francisco is part of the city, and then other parts that imply that California is separate, like where he gets his mind transferred to a separate body in California, so he can sneak out of the city. So it's kind of unclear and contradictory, but it apparently is not just New York.
I didn't catch that San Francisco one, but that seems too extreme. Like,
yeah.
I can't imagine the city's going through all that farmland in between, and then it's got to be... I don't know, something's not right there, but... yeah, I never even caught... Like, there's even some of the stuff you mentioned, like, I didn't pick up... the Statue of Liberty one, I didn't even notice that one.
Yeah, that one, that was kind of late in the series. It was around the time of, I think, of that last... I'm trying to remember, there were several kind of crisis points where there were riots and massacres and stuff,
right.
And I can't remember which one it was now.
Okay.
But I think it was around the time of that huge storm. There's this huge, crazy storm that comes that's actually said to be not as bad as ones that used to happen in the past.
Right.
I think it might have been around there, but it's just kind of in the background of one panel.
Right. Okay.
I just happened to notice it, the Statue of Liberty there.
Huh.
And other kind of weird, shocking stuff in the background. Like in an early issue, there's an ad for cigarettes for kids that has like a Mickey Mouse type character smoking cigarettes. But now I found some other things in this kind of contradictory.
Okay.
So in a way, so Spider is like fighting for the little guy, which assumes that like the powerful people are bad and the little guy is good. But on the other hand, it's kind of like everything and everybody is bad. And so if that's the case, what's Spider fighting for? I felt like a lot of the story was saying that the city was completely irredeemable. Everyone was terrible, and that all through the story we see this three-eyed smiley face, which early on, when Spider hands when Shannon first becomes his assistant, he hands her this a button of that three-eyed smiley face, and he mentions that it's a symbol of the transient movement, which we haven't talked about yet. But he says, think of it as a reminder, all people are scum, no matter what they look like.
Yeah.
So, is everyone bad in this world, or are some people more redeemable? I wasn't quite sure what
Well,
the take was.
yeah, it's a really interesting thing. I think it's one of the interesting things about it because, when the election happens and they vote for this guy Callahan, who's nicknamed the Smiler because he's always got this huge shit-eating grin on his face. There's a speech that Spider gives to a reporter where he's talking about he can't believe that people voted. He says he describes how awful Callahan is. And then his conclusion is, and who do you think they vote for? They voted for the worst guy, which is, and there are parts where he talks about how much he hates the city. There are times where it seems like he loves the city.
Yeah, well, he calls his column, I hate it here.
I hate it here. Yes, and he never wanted to come back. He actually wants to go up, live in the hills, and grow vegetables. But I think he has a lot of sympathy for the people that are lowest on the ladder, like homeless people, people who have been. There's a whole issue about homelessness in this time, and it's especially caused by these people called revivalists who have been cryogenically frozen hundreds of years before, wake up and are so culture shocked that they can't function.
Yeah, which I thought that was a really interesting idea and very believable. That there's talk of that kind of technology, of course, now in real life, but I can imagine that happening. You'd wake up in this world that you couldn't kind of fit into.
Yeah. And so he's sympathetic to those people. He's sympathetic to these kids who have been pushed into child prostitution. He is sympathetic to people who have been screwed by the mental health system. There's a whole issue about that. So I don't know if does he feel like if government is good, then does he feel that people are dumb because of bad government? You know what I mean? Like, some people believe that if we fix the education system and government, then everybody will gain the intelligence that has been kind of suppressed by the systems that are in place. I don't know. It's never made explicit, and I'm kind of okay with it being contradictory. I think that's kind of part of what the series is about.
Yeah, it was also contradictory that, the government is bad and screwing people, and at the same time, sometimes there are these, like, convenient laws that he's able to use to get his message out or whatever. Right. It's like, well, why are there these helpful laws? They kind of... somebody forgot to repeal them, or
yeah, he doesn't really break the law, does he? I think he tries
for the most part. Yeah, like rereading the first volume there, when Spider is like writing, straight into his editor's computer, and then the editor, Royce, he makes a deal with another media company to have Spider's typing appear on the screen live, and many people are watching it. And Royce is talking like on the phone to some government person and pointing out there was some amendment that allows him to do that.
Right.
So like, well, that's helpful.
Right, and another thing is too. There's later on when Callahan's power mad and he's shutting down the press, he issues these D notices which stop articles from being published if they feel they're going to be damaging to the White House. And I mean, the newspapers at least obey that, including the Word, which is the paper that Spider's working for, obeys those D orders. They're not outlaws. They're not running them anyway. So he's always trying to find workarounds to that by going through, kind of non-official papers, or something like that.
Yeah, well, he ends up using the Hole, which I guess it says was originally meant to be mainly a porn outlet, but then ends up being his news outlet.
Right, a kind of pirate news outlet, yeah.
And I was interested to notice, rereading Volume 1, that the Hole is mentioned there briefly.
Yes.
Shannon is subscribing to it, so it was kind of in the bloodstream from the beginning.
Yeah, almost everything's in it from the beginning.
Yeah, well, I feel like Warren Ellis planned it out pretty well from the start.
Yeah.
Although it was interesting that kind of in the middle of the series, the plot kind of fades away for a while, and he's just kind of got these one-off issues where he touches on kind of world building. And there's, for a while, it feels like there's no story. It's just world building from issue to issue for 10 or 12 issues in
there's
there.
a few like that. There's a 3-issue science fiction arc which has the like the boyfriend that gets turned to gas, and also the revivalist. That's the whole thing about her getting revived, somebody coming back out of cryo freeze. And there's also this thing where these pavilions of all these places in the past have kind of been preserved. So there's 3 issues of that, and then there's 6 issues of something called the New Scum, which is kind of just, a lot of it's just Spider wandering through the city and talking about the people in the city and stuff like that. But often I found the pacing was quite interesting in a lot of issues, because a lot of times it's him just watching TV for 20 pages, but at some stage in the issue, he will make a decision, or a phone call will come in that says you have to go interview the president, or he decides I'm going to find evidence on this guy, and that's the only real element of this major 60-issue story arc that's picked up in that issue, and the rest of it's kind
of... there might be a little reference to it, but it's not the main thing in the issue.
Yeah.
Coming up, transhumanism in Transmetropolitan. A world where everything seems terrible, and yet some things aren't as bad as they used to be. Some famous images that Robertson repurposes, and more. I'm producing this episode in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, as I travel around the U.S. gathering interviews that you'll be hearing on the podcast over the next few months, and also some material for To the Batpoles podcast. I've been to Minneapolis, and in the next 2 weeks I'll be in Chicago, Columbus, Denver, Laramie, and Portland. I'm bearing the cost of my travel, but if you'd like to help defer the costs of my podcast gathering trek, I'd really appreciate it if you'd support the podcast on Patreon at patreon.com/deconcomics. Patrons have special access to additional video and audio files there. Or you can make a one-time donation of any amount through PayPal. Send it to donate@deconstructingcomics.com. We appreciate your support. When you watched Batman as a kid, you enjoyed the colorful heroes and villains, the text sound effects on the screen, the thrill of watching a heroic crime fighter escaping from death traps and taking down bad guys. But the show was devised to interest adults, too. What did you miss as a kid? Sexual innuendo.
The penguin's too small for me.
Closeted gay characters.
I like that cape, Batman.
Freudian death traps.
Has the giant clam really swallowed Robin?
Police incompetence.
Bruce Wayne is a millionaire playboy. Hardly a secret identity for Batman.
Whether you're a kid or an adult, there's something to like about our favorite Caped Crusader. Tim and Paul dig for the deeper meanings under the Batmania every first, third, and fifth Thursday of the month. What's the podcast's name?
To the Batpoles. To
To the bat poles, to the bat poles.
There's also an interesting point in there where the media companies have sort of cartoonized Spider, and they're doing all these different kind of takes on him that he complains about because they're by making him a cartoon, they're taking away his power. They're normalizing him. I thought that was an interesting idea too. Rather than suppressing him, just making him, co-opting him. Yes.
Yeah, making him into a corporate product, which he hates. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was interesting too. But again, that's another thing that, I can't imagine that happening to any reporter like Cronkite.
No.
In the real world.
No. Well, and nowadays there's so much media that nobody really can stick out like that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. That's true. Yeah. I think that's it's interesting that's something that Warren Ellis didn't pick up on, because he was back in the early mid-90s, he was one of the first guys that had a web page and was like really active on the internet and was really into that kind of stuff. And he had multiple websites. So you'd think that's the kind of thing he would have really predicted, that the media would be so scattered that people wouldn't really lock on to one thing. But there is something in some way, there's some stuff that was just so true in it. Like, when the election's coming on, there's all these billboards and flyers and stuff. He's talking about how they're surrounded by all this stuff about the election. But he says, quote, they don't care. They don't even notice. And it just felt so much like the low voter turnouts and all the shit that's going on that just happened in the last election.
Yeah.
And there's a line he says to the current president, and I mean the previous president and the current president combined, to me, are the current U.S. president, because there are lines that apply so well to both of them. There's a great line where he says to the previous one, "You're not interested in anything other than having the presidency, but you're not interested in actually being a president." Mm-hmm. And I thought that was just such a great encapsulation.
Yeah. The first president, we never even know his real name, because in Spider's earlier run, before he went to the mountains, he got everyone to call that guy the Beast. And so he's just never referred to anything other than the Beast. And then the Beast is defeated by Gary Callahan, who's also known as the Smiler. But yeah, we do know his real name in that case.
Yeah.
I wanted to talk a little bit about this transient movement.
Sure.
It refers to these people who are permanently changing their species. And
it could be temporary though.
Well, yeah. He talks about, there's the leader of this group, whose name is Fred Christ. Talks about that there can be temporary ones, but his movement, they're kind of permanent, I think.
Okay.
Now, Wikipedia, in the very first sentence of its article, says, Transmetropolitan is a cyberpunk transhumanist comic book series. Now, the transients are transhumanist, but I'm not sure if you would... I wouldn't say the Transmetropolitan is promoting transhumanism or advocating it.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure if it's correct to call it transhumanist, but there is transhumanism in it.
Yeah. That's a weird assessment by whoever wrote that.
Yeah. But yeah, there is a lot of...
Because in fact, Fred Christ is totally corrupt as well. Mm-hmm. And he gets what he deserves at the end. And he's really hated by Spider for being... he's another leader in his own way, and he's only became leader of the movement because he wanted attention. He talks about how he never got anything in life, and he wanted to be a big guy for once. So he founded this religion.
Yeah, and then, of course, he takes advantage of it for sex and whatever else.
Exactly, yeah.
But, we never find out what Fred Christ looked like before. But Spider comes back from the mountains and finds that, half of Fred's head now looks like an alien.
Yeah.
And I guess that's it's only a partial transformation, that he's not finished transforming yet, or I didn't quite grasp it. But But a lot of the members have like one sort of alien eye and one human eye.
Yeah. I don't remember. I feel like they described the process, and I probably didn't pay enough attention to it.
And then there are other kinds of things like, so Shannon, when we first see her, is working as a prostitute. And
she's a stripper, isn't she?
A stripper, that's right. And we see her boobs, but instead of nipples, she has like UPC symbols on them. And that's never really explained. Like
it isn't, but later on, someone says maybe it was in the porn parody version of Spider.
Yeah.
But she says something about my breasts, and he says, "You don't have nipples." So it is mentioned again.
But then I think later on in the series, we see her again, and she has nipples. I didn't quite get what's going on there.
Okay. Well, I would say that but that might just be a modification. Like, I think transhuman is another thing where you're changing your DNA as opposed to just modding your nipples or even having screens on your skin might not necessarily.
Yeah, that would just be body modification, I think.
Right. So I think that's kind of in a different
changing
category.
Your species. Yeah.
But then there's an interesting thing there too, where part of the whole scandal that unravels the Callahan presidency is that he had sex with a transhuman prostitute, and she has reverted back to being human. And I remember reading that and thinking, well, this is another great example of Warren Ellis knowing exactly what he's writing and what we're going to complain about. Because I was reading this going, 200 years in the future, is anybody going to care who or what the president has sex with? I thought, is there going to be such a thing as a sex scandal for a politician 200 years in the future?
It might be, current mores being carried into the future, which isn't necessarily accurate.
Right, but then there's this other reporter called McX. I think he's kind of a major character, and he makes the comment as soon as the scandal breaks. He's like, there's an exact quote where he says something like, "It remains to be seen whether anyone will actually care." Or sorry, I found it. I even wrote it down. It remains to be seen whether illicit sex is actually damaging to a president in this day and age. So again, it's like Warren Ellis cutting off whatever complaint you might have before you can actually speak it. So it almost didn't matter that he had sex with the transient prostitute. Ultimately, it's not the real thing that clinches his downfall. It's just one element. I don't know how to. I think that's another thing that, Warren Ellis as a futurist would be very interested in people modifying their DNA like that, way beyond body modification. And I only saw it as that. I didn't see it as any sort of advocation of it. I just thought it was another thing he was interested in as a writer, and kind of shows up in his writing in other places too. Right.
Yeah. It doesn't feel like he's an advocate of it.
Right.
Let's see. Oh, another thing in the contradiction department, that things have improved in some ways since Spider was a kid. In issue 25, he talks about when he was a kid, the rain was poisoned, but now it's safe. So the government apparently, or someone, has done something good for the Earth, and I found that a little surprising in this world where everything seems to be terrible.
Well, there's a couple of interesting things like that. Like, for example, the makers use garbage. So people are picking up garbage off the streets and taking it home to put into their makers so that they can reprocess it into something useful that they want. So it's kind of cleaner because there's less garbage around.
Yeah.
And there were a few other things like that too that were like, there's like you can get a trait. There's this poor woman and her daughter, and she can't afford to eat, but she's hoping she can afford to buy money for a trait which will suppress her appetite. So it's kind of a solution for hunger, like it's literally to kill the hunger, so you don't need to eat as much. So there's kind of some technological workarounds for current world problems in there, which again I think as a somebody who's interested in the future, that Ellis has kind of thought through these things or has read about possibilities. So there were some interesting, and the storm, even the superstorm was not as bad as the superstorm he saw, before. Yeah.
There are a couple of points you might have noticed, too, where a panel is directly copying some famous image.
Yes.
One of them is in issue 32, where for some reason he borrows the Edward Hopper painting Nighthawks. The people in the restaurant late at night, and the cafe that they're in Transmetropolitan is called Hoppers.
Right.
And I wasn't sure why that was there, other than just for fun.
I don't know if that was, but some of those things are not. I don't know if they're Ellis. They might be Robertson having fun.
Yeah.
League of Extraordinary Gentlemen is a bit like that too, because Kevin O'Neill puts in stuff there that Alan Moore hasn't actually written in the scripts. He's just packing the background with stuff.
But then the other one I had in mind, I think that must have been Ellis's idea. So oddly, there's a university named after Dick Cavett, which was like, what? Why? But in issue 57, there's a massacre there where students are protesting, and they're passing out these stickers of the three-eyed smiley face. And as a kid is reaching into his jacket for the sticker maker, one of the cops sees it as a potential threat, and then they just all start shooting. And there's a panel that is clearly modeled on the Kent State Massacre photo from, was it, like 1970 or so. The photographer's name I actually looked up, except I'm not sure how to pronounce it. John Philo, I'm not sure.
Okay.
And I thought, if you're going to copy that, it must be for some purpose, to copy that kind of tragic image.
Yeah.
And the only purpose I could think of was to remind us that such a thing has actually happened. Although there were a lot more people killed in the one in Transmet than were in Kent State. Only 4 people killed and 9 wounded at Kent State, but it looks like a lot more casualties in this one.
It's a very similar situation, and I mean the student protest is kind of what brings upon the toppling of the presidency more than anything else, because that starts the snowball effect where people are they're shooting unarmed students, and everybody starts freaking out and rioting.
Right, and Spider makes sure that message gets out so everybody knows what happened.
Yeah, but are you feeling like the use of that image was a little bit exploitative?
Well, at first I was like, why are you using this? But then I thought, there's so much crazy stuff in this series, kind of this over-the-top violence and whatever, and it's easy to say, oh yeah, this is just fiction, anything can happen in this. And I think it's useful for his purposes to remind us that this kind of thing really happened, in the United States of America, and make you take it a little more seriously.
It's a very serious moment. I mean, it's maybe the key moment of the whole series. I didn't really. I was fine with it. It was probably the way to make it the most dramatic.
I didn't have a problem. I didn't have a problem with it. Yeah, I think it does make you sit up and take notice.
Yeah. Did you notice there was a high school called McVeigh High School?
Yes.
In my mind, that name only means one thing.
Yeah.
And I don't know any other McVeighs.
Right, and his name would have... Yeah, it's not too early for his name to be known. I felt like... I can't remember where they were, but there were other references to things being named after horrible people. like dictators and stuff.
Yeah.
I think there was an Idi Amin something, or I don't remember
yeah,
now.
you're right. I don't remember.
But so that I was surprised to see Dick Cavett name in there. Like he's not a murderer.
It's some sort of statement about celebrity. But it's funny too, because at this stage in time, like the Schacht, who is the main political advisor to Callahan, does not know who Bobby Kennedy is. And there's another, McVeigh's research team has no idea who anybody from 50 years or from our time is.
Well, yeah, I mean, that fits with the idea of the past having been forgotten so that people don't even know what year it is.
Yeah. Did you think... I find the political thing of this series is so fascinating to me. Did you feel like there was a change after 9/11, or do you think that he stayed the course for whatever he started out to do? It's so interesting to me that it happened like it was right at the midpoint almost of the series, or close, 2/3 of the way through.
Oh, you mean that massacre?
Yeah.
Yeah, I wondered about that. I didn't try to figure out like exactly what would have been the first issue to come out, or to have been written after 9/11. But so the series ended in 2002, so not very much of it would have been written after 9/11.
That's true.
Yeah, I don't feel like that affected the story very much. If it had run longer or started later, maybe it would have more.
Yeah.
But there wasn't really a suggestion of like foreign terrorist groups or anything.
That's true.
So yeah, I don't think that has an effect.
Yeah, it is interesting though that he said it in the city and not London. And I kind of, initially I wondered why he didn't set it in the UK.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's certainly enough British English in the story.
Yeah.
Sometimes it feels a little odd.
I think maybe, but it kind of occurred to me that, like, the US probably has the strongest freedom of speech laws in the world, and maybe that was a major
well, and it's
part
being
of it.
published in the United States, so
That's
you
true,
kind of have to
too.
fit it to your audience.
Yeah.
But that's something that I've noticed in other, these other, like Alan Moore, you read Watchmen and it's taking place in the U.S., but there's definitely some British English in the dialogue.
But I'm just remembering lines, like there's a line where the Smiler says, he says, you can give Spider airtime, just give me the same airtime, but there's a line where he says, do give people the real news. And I was like, what year was this written?
Fake news?
I kind of felt like I was often, I really kind of wondered and wished it was out now. Like it was 20 years too early. I just wonder what it would look like if he did a sequel, writing it in 2017, but then he might have to write it again in 2037. Who knows?
Yeah. So, we've been going on almost an hour here already.
Yeah.
So, how did you feel about the ending?
Well, are you talking about the denouement, like the last issue, or are you talking about the finale of the...
Okay, well, yeah, up to issue 59 in particular, I'm talking about. Because, we could talk about issue 60 too, but yeah, let's about 59.
I was... I was fine with it. I think it was okay. I don't know how much you want to spoil it. I think the way he shut down the president was there were certain conveniences there, and actually the TV show 24 I found ripped off this about 10 years later, where somebody walks up to the corrupt president and gets them to rant about all the horrible stuff they've done, and they've secretly got a microphone and a pen. And something happens here which is very similar, and I thought it's a bit convenient that Callahan had forgotten about that, and it was just, Ellis brought back the same kind of trick. He kind of got what he deserved, and I think it's kind of mentioned in the denouement that he might, the epilogue, it's mentioned in the epilogue that he kind of might get out of it. Like, he's still not in jail. Like, he's got all these lawyers, and he's spending all this money. He's hemorrhaging money, and eventually he will run out of money, and he will end up having to go to jail.
Well, yeah, and I like that it was nuanced. I mean, I sort of expected it would end up with Callahan, dying a bloody, terrible death.
Right.
And because there's a lot of that kind of catharsis in the story, but I kind of liked that it was more nuanced.
I agree completely. Yeah.
And it felt more kind of believable that way.
Yeah.
And the last issue I thought was perfect.
Yeah.
and exactly kind of what you would expect too. Having read the whole series.
Yeah. And it's kind of, I don't know. I don't want to give away too much of it.
Yeah, I think that's all I'm going to say about it. But just I thought it worked. It couldn't have ended any other way and been as satisfying.
Right. Right. I agree. I agree completely with that.
Anything else you want to say?
I do want to say that there were the covers were done by a variety of amazing people, including, as I mentioned, Jeff Darrow, Frank Whiteley. There were a couple of three. They usually do three, because everything was in threes. And I must say that the reason, because I read the first trade paperback many years ago, when I think probably as they were started coming out, and they were coming out in 3-issue trade paperbacks, which was so dumb. I was just like, I'm not going to buy these every 3 months. Like, why not? I was just like, no. So I quit at the time. So anyway, everybody gets 3 covers. I must mention that Jaime Hernandez does 3. And there's one where Shannon and Yelena, the other assistant, are basically Maggie and Hopi on the cover. It was really ballsy.
Which issues were those?
Hernandez ones. Boy, I'd have to flip through them all and find them.
I kind of remember seeing those, but it's kind of a blur at this point.
Yeah, and you don't spend a lot of time looking at the covers. Mobius did some, like 3, and Glenn Fabry did 3. Am I going to be able to find them? Bradstreet. Darrick Robertson. Another amazing thing is that Darrick Robertson stuck with the series. Like, there's no fill-in issues.
Yeah, that kind of surprised me too. Yeah.
So around 33 is the one with the Maggie and Hopi cover.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember seeing this and thinking it had to have been.
Right.
I get them mixed up now because it's been a while since I read Love and Rockets, but clearly it's a Hernandez.
Yeah, that's a Jaime cover. He did 3 in a row there, as did most people. Yeah, I mean, I think it's an amazing series. It's probably not going to be to everyone's tastes. But I think we've given fair warning about everything you might hate about it in this podcast. So if any of those things, all the talk about shit and semen is going to turn you off, don't read it. If you lean the other way politically, don't read it. It's just going to make you angry. But for anyone else, it's one of the major series. I'm glad we finally got around to it. I'm glad we did all 60 for sure.
Well, would you say that it's liberal or that it's populist?
Wow.
I'm not sure that I would necessarily say that it's liberal. I mean, it's just fighting for the little guy. So, yeah, come to think of it, I'm not sure that a conservative would necessarily be turned off by it. I mean, you can kind of put your own political beliefs on top of it and mesh them together.
Yeah, you might be right. I might be oversimplifying. But there are certain things like his the fact that he complains about the mental health system as opposed to the people who are ruined by it, to me that's more left leaning. You know what I mean? Where if you complain about the institution, so I don't know. Yeah, I might have oversimplified, but
yeah, I mean, there might be liberal things in it, but I think if you're into populism, you could liberal or conservative, you could enjoy it. Perhaps
I think it's one of those maybe but maybe you could read it as a story and without any political. Like those people that read Watchmen and say skip the pirate parts. You could be one of those guys that reads
just
Transmet.
Think of it as another superhero story. Yeah.
Well, or sort of a kind of a hard-boiled crime story. This reporter that goes around and beats up people. We never even talked about his drug addiction, which is addressed as a drug addiction in the book.
Mm-hmm. He's Hunter S. Thompson. He has to have a drug addiction.
That's totally true. But there's a whole issue that's like he's on the drugs again. What are we going to do? And all this kind of stuff. So, so you might be able to read it just as a cool kind of story. I guess maybe there are people out there that do that. Yeah,
it could be appreciated on that level too. And it does get there are some points that are pretty exciting.
Yeah.
So. Yeah, it's just as a thriller. It parts of it are thriller. Yeah, there is that kind of slow period in the middle that's a lot of vignettes and world building. But it does have some exciting moments. I'm not necessarily bought into the crudeness, but as a story, it does work pretty well. I'm glad to have finally read it.
Yeah, and I do think it was politically prescient. There's so many lines you'll read in there that are just like, this is today.
Yes. Transmetropolitan is published by Vertigo. We'd love to hear from you. Write us at mail@deconstructingcomics.com or look us up on Patreon, Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. All our social media links can be found on the right sidebar at deconstructingcomics.com. Also, please give us a review on Apple Podcasts or Stitcher. Our theme is from bensound.com. If you're looking for some constructive feedback on your comic, send it to us and Mulela and I will critique it on our spin-off podcast, Critiquing Comics. Send it to mail@deconstructingcomics.com. We'll read at least 30 pages of it and critique it on the show. Last Thursday's episode is right behind this episode in the podcast feed. This coming Thursday on To the Bat Poles, Season 2 ends with Eli Wallach's turn as Mr. Freeze. Look up To the Bat Poles wherever you find your podcasts or at tothebatpoles.libsyn.com. Next week, a very Canadian episode. Kum in Toronto and Ian, a Canadian living in Sapporo, Japan, discuss Montreal-based press Drawn and Quarterly. Have their books gotten artier over the years? Specifically, they discuss Michelle Rabagliati's 2005 book Paul Moves Out and the latest from Gillian Tamaki, Boundless. Also, a deep dive into the past history of the Toronto comic shop The Beguiling. Till then, this is Tim, and thanks for listening to Deconstructing Comics.